When did your manager learn that some shifts can't be covered? My manager Wendy scheduled me for a shift during my mother's funeral in February, even though I'd given her 3 weeks notice about the exact date and time. I'd submitted the bereavement paperwork the day my mother died and circled the funeral date in red on the calendar in her office. She approved my time off request and said she was sorry for my loss, then scheduled me anyway for the exact hours of the service. When I saw the schedule posted, I went to her office and pointed out the mistake. Wendy looked at the schedule and said it wasn't a mistake because we were short-staffed that day and she needed all hands on deck. I reminded her that my mother's funeral was that day and she said I could attend the viewing the night before instead. She actually said funerals were for the living anyway, so my mother wouldn't know if I missed it. I stood there shocked while she explained that work commitments came first and I'd have plenty of time to grieve after my shift. She said if I really cared about my job, I'd understand that the restaurant needed me more than a dead person did. When I said I absolutely would not be coming in during my mother's funeral, Wendy threatened to write me up for insubordination. She said I was being selfish and putting my personal life above the team. She actually used the words personal life like my mother's death was equivalent to wanting to go to a concert. She said everyone had problems, but professionals didn't let that affect their availability. She told me that when her hamster died, she still came to work the same day because that's what responsible adults do. I told her that comparing my mother to her hamster was disgusting, and she said death was death and I was being too emotional. She suggested I needed to toughen up if I wanted to succeed in the restaurant industry. She said she'd already promised a big party reservation that I'd be working that day because I was the best server and she couldn't disappoint customers just because I was sad. The day of the funeral, I obviously didn't show up for work because I was burying my mother. Wendy called me 15 times during the service and left messages saying I was letting everyone down and she'd have to write me up. She texted me that I needed to come in immediately after the burial because the dinner rush was starting. She actually said that since the funeral part was over, there was no reason I couldn't work the rest of my shift. She said she'd even let me keep my funeral clothes on if I didn't have time to change into my uniform. When I didn't respond, she texted that I was fired for no call no show and abandoning my shift. She said I could come collect my final paycheck minus the cost of having to call in another server at overtime rates. She actually deducted money from my last check because she had to pay someone else time and a half to cover the shift she'd illegally scheduled me for. She left a voicemail saying I'd never work in this town again because she'd tell every restaurant owner what an unreliable employee I was. That's when I decided Wendy needed to understand what real loss felt like. I started by contacting corporate about her behavior since we were a chain restaurant. I forwarded them all her texts and voicemails from my mother's funeral showing she'd harassed me during the service. I included the approved bereavement paperwork and the schedule showing she'd scheduled me anyway. I also mentioned she'd compared my mother's death to her hamster and deducted money from my check for missing an illegally scheduled shift. Corporate was horrified and launched an investigation immediately. Next, I reached out to every current and former employee I knew and asked if Wendy had ever denied them bereavement leave or scheduled them during emergencies. Turns out she'd done this repeatedly. One server had missed his father's surgery, another had been scheduled during her brother's wedding she'd requested off 6 months prior, and 3 people had been fired for not showing up during approved vacation time. We all filed complaints with corporate on the same day. I also contacted the labor board about wage theft since she'd illegally deducted money from my final paycheck for refusing to work during approved bereavement leave. They were very interested in a manager who thought she could charge employees for using legally protected time off. They opened an investigation into all of Wendy's payroll decisions and found numerous violations where she docked pay for sick days and breaks. The real karma came when Wendy's own mother had a heart attack the following month. Full story on channel, link below.